Welcome to Transformation 2.0, the podcast for change leaders. My name is 𝗞𝗲𝘆 and in each episode we bring you real conversations with executives, innovators, and experts who are shaping the future of business. Whether you are leading a team, scaling a company, or navigating the challenges of transformation, this podcast will provide you with insights, strategies, and inspiration to drive meaningful change. Join us as we explore what it takes to lead, adapt, and thrive in an ever-evolving world. Let's get started. Welcome to another episode of Transformation 2.0. We are speaking to Venkat Venkataraman, Professor Emeritus at the 𝗞𝗲𝘆 School of Business at Boston University. And he's the author of the Digital Matrix and the co-author of the Fusion Strategy. And we're going to be talking about the industrial transformation and transition to digital future for traditional businesses today. And talking a little bit about Venkat's storied career. Obviously, Venkat, you graduated from IIT with a Bachelor of Technology, and you did your MBA at IIT. And then you went on to University of Pittsburgh to do your PhD in strategic management on information systems. And then you spent a bit of a stint with MIT as an associate professor before you joined 𝗞𝗲𝘆 School of Business. And then you had a 30-year career. I must say that's as long as I've been working in the industry. So you've been teaching people like me for as long as I've been working in the industry. And I'm really privileged that you're on this podcast today. And just for the listeners, so Venkat is the David J. McGrath Jr. Professor of Management, teaching students across undergrad and postgrad levels for digital business, digital strategy, and IT strategy. And obviously, Venkat, you've been part of two books, Digital Matrix, the first book that you wrote about new rules for business transformation through technology, which you authored by yourself, and then obviously Fusion Strategy, how real-time data and AI will power the industrial future, which you co-authored with your good friend Vijay Govindarajan at the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth. It's quite the career you've had, and I'm really privileged that you are joining this podcast today. And thank you again. And maybe for the listeners' benefit, tell us a little bit about maybe the most memorable moment in these years, if you want to recall one. I'm sure there must be lots, but what's the biggest moment that you can put your finger on?
Thank you, 𝗞𝗲𝘆. Well, I'm sure there's many that come to mind, but the most pivotal aspect of my academic career was when I joined MIT in 1985. Very soon after that, we started a research project that was quite unusual in the history of the business school. We were starting a project called Management in the 1990s. And for the first time, we were looking ahead rather than trying to explain what has happened in the past, which has typically been the research in business schools. And we were asking the question, how will information technology impact the way we understand about business, what we teach, what we research, and what we tell companies to practice? How will information technology change the landscape of business? And you got to remember 1985, the best piece of hardware we had was an IBM PC with a green screen. The best piece of software was Lotus 123.
I remember that.
Computers were not connected. We had no idea what the internet was going to be. But the question stayed in my mind. Why are we having this disconnect between IT and business? And how do we create a bridge, the language of connecting business and IT? So that has stayed with me for the last 35, 40 years of my professional career.
That's quite a poignant point to discuss on this topic of digital transformation and business transformation, because essentially what you're saying is back in 1985, you actually started this concept of how do you marry technology and business together to create a strategy that creates value for the organization. So to me, I can really relate to that topic, because that's very much what my passion is as well. So I really want to hear a lot more about this. But before we sort of go into the details, let's discuss your book, Digital Matrix: The New Rules for Business Transformation Through Technology, which I actually read this book as part of my research on the upcoming book that I'm writing, which is also on digital transformation. But I'm focusing more on how can organizations avoid a lot of the common pitfalls of transformation. But I read your book as part of the research, and I found it invaluable to structure my thinking. And as you described succinctly, what is digital? How is it reshaping business models, and why the leaders need to think differently, right? And I think like there were quite a few themes in the book that I'd like to deep dive into. But I think the first one that I want to pick on is this concept of digital landscape. The book discusses the concept of digital landscape in quite a bit of detail, and I would love to unpick that a little bit and maybe get to the details of what do you mean by this digital landscape, and how is that different to the traditional landscape that the traditional brick and mortar businesses have been operating in.
Yeah, I think the easiest way to look at it is we are the industrial age. The industrial age gave us very defined definitions of the industry. It defined what the company was doing inside. It defined supply chain. It defined value chains. It defined functions. Now, as we transition from the industrial age to the post-industrial age, that in 2015, I was beginning to see that digital companies are coming into traditional industries and changing the business landscape. For example, what was advertising in the 1970s and 80s was completely upended by Google, that was essentially a player in the advertising industry, but they redefined advertising as analytics and algorithms, right? Apple came in and redefined telecom, which was largely a hardware and a connectivity business. Now it became hardware, software, cloud, and connectivity business.
And content.
So and content, right? And everything got connected. So what you beginning to see is that the competitors that we knew and we were competing against are no longer going to be the competitors of the future. So the landscape was really being redefined by digital companies. Then I went further and said, what are the dominant patterns of these new digital competitors? These are not just the startups, but they are also the big digital giants. And historically, we have seen, especially with Clay Christensen's work on disruption, that the disruption typically comes from new entrants that start in a relatively unattractive position and start to become attractive as they scale up. We were beginning to see, and we're obviously seeing right now, 10 years later, a lot of the digital companies coming into industries that they didn't have any role to play. But as industries become digital, they have an important role to play because they can solve the problems of the transformation that the incumbents are not able to solve. So that's what allowed me to lay out this logic of 3 different types of players: the incumbents, the digital giants, and the ambitious tech startups or the tech entrepreneurs, and said the digital business landscape itself is changing. So recognize who your new competitors are going to be as your industry becomes digital, as your company becomes digital. And so that was my thinking at 2015, was really to take a strategic logic to digital transformation rather than assume that the business logic is going to be the same and all you have to do is make incremental innovation or incremental adjustment to your strategies.
That's quite interesting that you were starting to see it even back in the 2015s. And I guess the next question I was going to ask was around these 3 types of players in the book. What are these 3 players, and what's their relation to digital transformation? And I guess maybe like if you really think about, just the landscape itself is shifting from being predominantly brick and mortar, where you're moving atoms, to you're now moving atoms plus electrons, right? and the atoms moves at a well, when we move atoms, they move at a pace that's probably close to glacial compared to when electrons move, right? So, and I think that's an important differentiator between these two worlds, right? When we move atoms, they move a lot slower. But whereas when it comes to data and when it comes to information, they move at a much more rapid pace. And I guess maybe what I want to try and delve into a little bit more about these sort of three types of players is, instead of it being just purely moving atoms from one place to another, when we talk about moving atoms plus electrons in terms of data and information, how does that change the dynamics? How does that impact the business model of how organizations create and perceive value?
Yeah, I think that was really an interesting point in 2015 as you begin to see industries digitizing, right? When industries start to digitize, you got this combination of bits and atoms that start to come in. Which part is going to drive the value creation, and which part do you need to adapt at what speed? So one of the things that I lay out in the book, which I fundamentally believe is even becoming important today in the context of AI, is this idea called scale, scope, and speed, the 3S of strategies, right? So if you look at scale, in the physical world, the scale was about owning the factories, owning the distribution, owning the product, right? And now that in the digital world, scale is about data scale. It's not about market share, it's about data scale. Scope, we had companies that went from standard chemicals to specialty chemicals because it is easier to build a factory or change the production line to get from standard chemicals to specialty chemicals. And then speed is really, companies knew how to manage linear speed. A 10% growth in the industrial age was considered phenomenal, right? A high single digit was considered, quite an accomplishment. Yeah. Now you're getting into the digital speed, which is 1x, 2x, 10x, right? We started hearing about.
You keep
hearing about 10x.
Yeah.
And the traditional industrial companies know how to operate linear speed. The digital companies start operating at non-linear speed. So when you put scale, scope, and speed together, the strategic logic of the industrial age companies is being challenged with the strategic logic of the digital age companies or the information age companies, right? And so that's what got me thinking about why the old strategic logic doesn't work. And then I started asking, who are these companies? And that's where I got to these three types of players. The incumbents that are struggling with their orthodox view of scale, scope, and speed. The digital company, especially the startup, that have a very narrow scope, but they got a phenomenally high speed. Then you got the big digital giants that are both scale, scope, and speed, right? You got Alphabet, which went from advertising to being a portfolio company that has scale, scope, and speed. Then you got Amazon that has scale, scope, and speed, from being not just an e-commerce company, but e-commerce company with physical aspect, with food distribution, actual logistics with Amazon Prime, then also having digital with Amazon Music and Amazon Video, and then obviously the cloud with Amazon Web Services. It's redefining scale, scope, and speed in a way that traditional companies didn't quite know how to do. So that's the idea of looking at every digital business landscape will be occupied by these three types of players. Sooner or later, you will compete against born digital companies that are much more agile and born digital companies that have the scale and scope and speed to compete against you.
That's very interesting. I know we're gonna talk a little bit about looking at a traditional company and sort of how they need to adapt to the modern digital world through going through digital transformation. But in the meantime, I think like one of the things in the context of going through this transition is this concept of transformation. And in the book Digital Matrix, you talk about these three phases of transformation. And if you could dive a little bit deep into this and explore what that means, that would be a really good way to try and understand the structure that it provides leaders to think about in terms of navigating through this change in the organizations. Would you mind elaborating that three phases of the
Yeah,
transformation a bit, please?
I think what I was trying to do in 2015 and what I continue to do in my lectures and workshop with companies is not to think of transformation as an end in itself, but it's a continuous cycle, a continuous journey, right? And when you look at transformation, not as a technical transformation, because one of the unfortunate part about digital transformation is that it has been overused. And the tech companies talk about digital transformation as migrating from on-prem to the cloud.
Yep.
Right? Or to shift from one type of architecture to a different type of architecture, because it is transformation.
Yeah.
To me, the digital transformation is better seen as digital business transformation, right?
Yeah.
Digital business transformation, which means you're transforming your business through the power of these digital technologies that are rapidly changing over time. So in the 1980s, as I said earlier, we had the digital transformation with devices given to professional workers. That obviously transformed how we do business, because we could collect data much more instantaneously, process it. Then we had the 1990s with major digital business transformation because of SAP and ERP, these big enterprise systems that transformed the business. Then in the 2000s, we had the internet that transformed the business, created e-commerce. Then later on, we had the mobile technology, and then we had the social technology.
Yeah.
So every one of that really transformed the business. So we really have to focus on digital business transformation rather than digital transformation per se. So then I said, how do we understand digital business transformation? At any point in time, some people are experimenting. And we have no idea whether those experiments are going to succeed or not, right? Blockchain, it may be a little bit of lull now, it may come back with quantum and AI. Robotics, we've been experimenting with robotics for a long time, but robotics is now picking up.
Yeah.
So I said there is experimentation going on, but my insight at that time was to talk about experimentation at the edge, which is not experimentation in your industry. It's not an experimentation that you're comfortable tracking. It's experimentation at the edge of your industry. It's edge of your comfort zone, which today may be irrelevant, like a drone, may be irrelevant for most. But when those experiments start to develop insights, then they start to scale up. And once those experiments scale up, they get to the second phase of transformation, which I call as collision at the core. The collision at the core is when the industrial age business models collide against the digital age business models. That's where the real transformation happens. When you look at a car as industrial combustion engine, and then when you look at a car as computers connected to the cloud, there is a collision. When you look at movies as going to a theater and watching it at fixed time, and then you bump up against streaming, that is time shifted, place shifted, device shifted, then you have a collision at the core. When you look at e-commerce and traditional commerce, you have collision at the core. So that really became the second phase of transformation. That doesn't mean experimentation has stopped.
Yeah, you still continue to
because somebody else
experiment.
is experimenting with something else.
There's a new idea that's being experimented on later, right?
Right. So don't look at this as phases where one phase is given up to the new phase. Every phase is going to continually operate. So managers need to simultaneously think about different phases of transformation. So the first one, as I said, is experimentation at the edge. The second one is collision at the core. And the third one is reinvention at the root.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the reinvention is a very important part of transformation. This is when we abandon what has made us successful because it's no longer going to be relevant in the future, right? Making movie theaters in the old way, looking at the transportation the old way, looking at logistics the old way, looking at payments the old way, looking at newspaper printing the old way, right? All of that is now no longer relevant. So reinvention at the root is really taking a fresh perspective and said, how will the business be in 2030? Or at that time, in 2015, I would do workshops and say, what will 2025 look like for you, right? And what part of what you're doing is still going to be relevant in 2025? And are you now proactively shifting to that future rather than clinging on to what you're good at today, right? Success is about reallocating resources. So that's what led me to talk about these three phases of transformation, but then continuously track experimentation at the edge.
That's it. Yeah.
Collision at the core, reinvention at the root.
It's a continuous exploration.
What is the window? Exactly. It's a continuous cycle.
Exploration and
but
exploitation.
Continuously asking the question, what is the window you have over which you need to transform, right? And that becomes important for leaders.
That's a very nice phrasing, actually. I mean, when you were describing that, like it really hit me home, because back in 2015, I joined an organization that was very much focusing on services around a data center. And my mission as the innovation executive was to actually bring new service offerings to the market. So I focused on bringing cloud-based services as part of their service offerings. So yeah, when we started to get a bit of traction on that, yes, we said, yeah, some of these traditional services we offer, we need to actually rethink about what these are now. And to me, I think like the collision at the core, that really hit home when you actually was describing it. And it was a real collision, because you start talking about P&Ls, you start talking about the different service lines and how their revenue gets cannibalized, and how we need to think about in terms of what is the future. So it really becomes a political game. And I think, that's the challenge that a lot of organizations struggle with, right? And then in the end, I lived through the journey where, yes, I set up the digital transformation practice, and then we started to get revenue through that, and we grew it to about $10 million annual revenue, and that's when we started to see, we are creating these strategies that's driving new value. But then there's also a lot of pull-through work, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done to actually transform our clients' organizations. So we really I really lived through those three phases that you described. But I didn't think about it in those terms back when I lived through it.
Right. And then you begin to see the collision at the core when your top line and bottom line get directly affected, not by your traditional competitors doing things differently. The collision at the core starts to become relevant in a digital context when you're losing business to either big companies like the Googles, the Amazons, and the Apples of the world, or really small companies that are coming in, and your clients and customers are saying, I no longer want to do business with you because somebody else is providing a better value for me, right? So that's when the collision hits home.
Exactly. That's when you start seeing all these new entrants actually taking away your market share, right? And I think that's the point at which most organizations need to start thinking about, are we going to let them disrupt us, or are we going to disrupt ourselves? So we reinvent the customer base and create new revenue lines that actually replace our old revenue lines.
Yeah. And then if you stay with that same theme, 𝗲𝗲𝘆, when you see the collision today, don't stop there. Look at what experiments are going on today.
Yeah.
That's going to even make the collision even more serious in the next couple of years, right? Because it's a wake-up call. Now you got to now track the weak signal of experimentation at the edge. That's going to accelerate this collision going forward.
That's a great point. And I think moving on, I think the next area that I wanted to try and touch on from the book is these 3 winning moves that you talk about. And I think That's again another concept that I really liked, that the way you describe it. Can you maybe explain this to give leaders a bit of clarity around how it gives options to consider as organizations consider the digital transformation of their business?
Yeah, I think given what we just described, it really gives us the 3x3 matrix. That's why I called it the digital matrix, right? So the digital matrix are 3 players across 3 phases, and you're continuously trying to understand what the different moves of competitors are. And it's important to recognize that since I'm a business strategy professor to begin with an interest in digital technologies, my digital transformation focus has always been about strategic impacts, right? So this is about strategic impact. So then the 3 moves are really the 3 strategic moves. How are you co-creating value? What are the roles in the ecosystem? And then how do you combine humans and machines, right? Now you got to remember 2015, we had not had all the discussion about AI that we have today. And we can maybe come back and talk about that at a later point in time. But the idea of co-creating with competitors was really, if a few times people would ask me, how do you define a company? And I would say, historically in the industrial age, we've defined a company as a portfolio of products or a portfolio of businesses. Single business company has a set of products.
Yeah.
Multi-business companies have a multiple set of businesses. In the digital age, we need to think about a company as a portfolio of capabilities with a portfolio of relationships. Because no company has all the capabilities inside their companies. And you need to form relationships in order to complement your capabilities with new capabilities in the relationships. Now, this is much more important during the period of digital transformation, because your new capabilities are a combination of your traditional capabilities and digital capabilities. So you got to only co-create value. If you only co-create value inside your company, you're limiting to digital capabilities inside. And your competitors start co-creating value with their capabilities with digital companies. So this is an important part as you begin to understand the transformation is realignment of capabilities and relationships. So that's the first move. The second move is really looking at this as ecosystems, right? Looking at this as ecosystems. When we look at digital business transformation, you realize there's a new ecosystem being formed. The new ecosystem is traditional industry plus digital, right? Let's take a look at, telecom. Telecom is physical plus digital. So you need to have a completely different set of ecosystem. Payments is a new set of ecosystem, right? And in the book, I talk about the payment ecosystem. Suddenly Apple comes in and says, we're going to be in the payment ecosystem. What should Walmart do? Should Walmart join the ecosystem? Or should Walmart create its own ecosystem? That's a strategic move in digital transformation, because you're essentially deciding whether you want to be an orchestrator of that ecosystem or simply be a participant in the ecosystem, right?
Yeah.
Google created Google News at that time. Should newspapers be the orchestrator of news ecosystem, or should they be a participant in the Google News ecosystem? So the participant versus orchestrator is an ecosystem play. Co-creating value with your partner is a new strategic move. And then the third, but not least, which is becoming much more important today, is the role of humans and machines. And at that time, I was spending a lot of time with the IBM folks who are trying to create IBM Watson. And that's what led me to write these 3 zones, which 10 years later are proving to be exactly right when it comes to AI and agentic, which is the automation zone, the augmentation zone, and the amplification zone. Because you can't digitally transform your business if you have not taken advantage of AI. And we obviously explore more of that in the Fusion strategy book that we will discuss later.
Yeah, yeah. That's quite a nice way to look at it, actually. And I think I see this happening in a lot of industries today. I think, the concept of, yes, your ecosystems are actually changing. It's something that a lot of organizations are trying to wrap their head around. I think consulting as an industry is actually just facing this at the moment. And I think there's a lot of shifts happening that's going to be really interesting to watch.
Yeah, because where does management consulting end and where does technology operations begin, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So when you have McKinsey Quantum Black,
Yeah,
that's an important thing. Accenture Industry X,
yeah,
and what they announced yesterday at the Hanover Messe with Siemens
yeah.
and
The partnership with
Accenture
Siemens,
joining
yeah.
together to essentially accelerate engineering transformation. These are all part of the new ecosystem that will get created, pretty soon.
Definitely. Lots of interesting things to be part of, as well as to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I mean, you got to be both an observer and a
Participant, exactly.
right?
Yeah, indeed. And I think lastly, what I would like to do is maybe take a bit of a case study around a traditional business that has gone through this digital transformation and explore a few of the themes that you discuss in the book, right? So if you were to pick maybe one of the case studies that you've discussed either in the book or maybe one of the other case studies that maybe you've been looking at in detail, and talk a little bit about, how they adapted to the digital ecosystem, how they explored new ways of competing and collaborating, how they explored, how they leverage technology to enhance human capabilities, how they built teams to experiment and innovate, and how they, and lastly, how they evaluated their core beliefs to reinvent their strategies for the digital future. That would be a really great use of the remaining time we have on this.
Yeah, I think let me try to respond to that by asking the listener, the viewer of the podcast, to place themselves at the center of the digital matrix, which is they are an incumbent and they are at the collision at the core right now, right? So what I like them to do is think about a situation where they face competitive threats from digital giants from the top and ambitious startups from below. So they feel the squeeze, if you will. So position yourself in that center of the quadrant, the center of the matrix. Now, look at what are the experiments that you wish you had tracked 2 to 3 years back. What did you miss? What did you not see at that time? Or you saw, but you didn't understand the implications of that. Because it's a very important exercise to look back and say, we are facing the collision today because we didn't observe and interpret the signal the right way 2 to 3 years back. What did you miss and why did you miss? Right? As a mental discipline, that's important. Did we miss it because we were too functionally focused? Did we miss it because we didn't think it'll happen as fast? Did we miss it because we think it is not going to impact our industry, but it's going to impact other industry, right? We can ask all of these questions. That becomes important. The reason why I'm saying put yourself in the position of the center of the matrix is because that's when you feel the collision. It's being squeezed from both sides. Then you say, what is the venture capital move at that time that allowed an ambitious entrepreneur like Netflix to come into this space that you didn't think is going to have an impact, right? Because I remember very clearly this quote from the Time Warner CEO. When he was asked about Netflix, he said, I am the US Army why would I be worried about invasion from the Albanian army, namely Netflix?
Yep.
Today, Netflix is a $600 billion company worth more than all the other media companies put together, right?
Yeah.
So we got to really understand from where the pain point is. The pain point is today's collision. And I'm sure every one of your listeners and viewers will be able to find a pain point where the digital transformation is impacting them because they're being impacted by big digital companies and small startups, right? Then ask yourself the question, 2030, what will the reinvention look like in your industry? What's the business problem that will need to be solved? And who will solve it? Right? Are you going to be the rule maker to solve it? Or are you going to be the rule taker where somebody else is going to define the rules and you're going to follow the rules? That makes the digital matrix come alive by looking at all the cells and saying, in the reinvention, what will the digital companies do? What will the startups do in that space? Right?
Yeah.
Because digital transformation, ultimately, for every one of you, a viewer and a listener, is can you scale up? Sorry, can you transform before the startups scale up? Can you transform before the digital giants come into your industry with their scale and scope? Can you transform before the startups scale up and speed up, right? So scale, scope, and speed becomes important. So that matrix come alive. And then all the details that you mentioned about looking at, what will happen to the industry, whether you need to organize as functions or cross-functional, what do you do inside, what do you do outside, all fall in place when you now use the 9 cell of the matrix as your playbook, as your game board to play with, right? And we can look at historical industries and do it, but I like the viewer to not look at history because technology is changing so fast, but really place themselves at the center and then look at what the moves are. What are going to be their moves? What are their degrees of freedom to play compared to the degrees of freedom that the digital companies have? And also other incumbents have, right? You as a competitor, you got other formidable competitors. What if they form an ecosystem partnership with the digital company first, right? What will happen if Eli Lilly does something with Google or Novartis does something with Google? If you are another pharmaceutical company, are you falling behind? Or can you form a different set of partnership? That's why I talk about the ecosystem moves. That's why I talk about co-creating capabilities. And what is it that you can do with AI, where your humans and machines can do things that humans cannot do or machines cannot do by themselves. That's an easier way and a more powerful strategic way to look at it.
And I think that's a good reframing. And I think, trying to look at how an organization changed in the past versus looking at where they are today and thinking about what are the different aspects that they need to consider. That's a good reframing. That's actually the view that I usually take as well, which is more sort of forward-thinking view. And to me, I think like when you were describing that, what occurred to me is actually at the core of all these is actually business is about value creation and value capture, right? And I think that there's a way to create and capture value in the physical world. There's a way to create and capture value in the digital world, right? And I think a lot of the complementarities in the digital transformation happen when you actually look at opportunities where, yes, there is a physical value creation, but what's the digital value creation that overlaps that actually gives you that 10x or 100x or 1000x amplifier to your value creation, right? So how, like, I think, like when Apple created the iPhone, yes, they created a phone that still had the same sort of chips and the same sort of modules as what was in the phones of the past. But what they did differently was that they put this platform thinking into the iPhone. They had the iTunes that allowed people to connect and add content onto the store, Apple Store, and on the other side, people could actually buy these and pay for this, and then that created a whole new ecosystem for Apple, right? And I think looking at a company like, sorry.
Yeah, no, I think your example of Apple is right on, right? If you look at the physical component of Apple that Foxconn adds,
Yeah.
I think it's of the order of less than $100
Yeah.
for $1,000 phone, right?
Yeah.
Everything else is done by Apple. So if you see the back of an Apple device, it says designed by Apple in California, assembled in China or Malaysia or India or Indonesia, as the case may be. So the design and the entire architectural control
Yeah.
of that business model is what they have. And the chip in the beginning was similar, but then after that they started evolving all the chip around it to continue to add sensors to be able to go into other industries, right? There's a very interesting, often not well understood quote by Tim Cook, who then was asked, what is Apple's real impact in the industry? And he said, I don't want you to look at Apple as how it's impacted the industry, how it impacted today. He said, if you zoom out into the future and look back, you will notice that Apple's real impact would be in healthcare. That means he's really talking about reinvention at the root of the healthcare industry, of which the wearable device, like an Apple Watch, or the current version of the AirPods with the hearing aid built in, right? Hearing capability built in, or my Apple Vision Pro. All that is helping us live better. So healthcare. So when you look at reinvention at the root of the healthcare, real-time data becomes important, right? So it's not just the hardware and the software, it's all that ecosystem. And how do you amplify, and then how do you restructure the relationship, all becomes important. So that's part of the digital business transformation that I want the viewers and the listeners to take away.
Now that's a great point. I think Apple's always been a leader and a very futuristic thinker in terms of where they're headed. And I think the thing that I was gonna try and bring up around the iPhone and how they built that iPhone was I was watching this video by Steve Jobs where he spoke about how Apple was structured when they actually built the iPhone. I think they had about 5 or 6 different teams that were working on the different components of the iPhone. Some people worked on the hardware design and the hardware architecture, and some people worked on the software, and then some people worked on the app store. Some people worked on how they engage with the ecosystem to create apps. But what really hit home for me was how Steve Jobs described that when they go into a meeting, nobody is a leader, nobody is a follower. Everyone is an equal, and everyone actually understands what their part is, and they can exactly tell in detail what they're doing to actually enable that unified vision that Steve Jobs had created. And I think that's the thing that I really want to sort of bring home with this Apple example, right? Because what it does is that, sorry, you're going to say something.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It's having the vision of where the future is, which is reinvention. Right? Rather than incrementally tinkering around your current business model. Because let's take the idea of transformation, that word. Right? Transformation is changing the rules. And what he did was change the rules. And he didn't organize it as functions. He didn't organize it as divisions. Right? He didn't have an iTunes division, an iPod division, and an iPhone division. Everything is connected. That's what I meant by a company is a portfolio of capabilities with the relationships, and the relationship with TSMC, relationship with Foxconn that assembled it, all was very, very important. And then I think his real brilliance to me was the creation of the Apple Store. At a time when everybody was closing the physical store, he created a physical store because he said, what I want is I want people to experience the product and to have a person, the genius bar, to ask questions on how to use the device, because the device is not, we want it to be simple, but we want also to have people have the comfort of walking in and having somebody explain to them, right? That human interaction. That's brilliant, because you've got so many Apple stores not just architectural marvel of design,
Yeah.
but also way in which people experience the product.
Mm. No, that's a great point that you made about the Apple Store. And like I go to the shopping center nearby that has an Apple Store, and I take my 8-year-old, and when he goes in there, he gets lost, right? And sometimes he's in this section where they have gaming devices. He's playing one of those games, and I know how difficult it is to actually disconnect him and bring him out. So Apple
Yeah,
really showed that yes, by giving that experience, you can actually not just give people an understanding of the product you're selling, but you can really get people to experience the product you're selling, right? And I think that experience is one of the things that Apple really paid a premium for, right?
yeah.
Yeah,
Even today, when you just walk into any competing store, you'll find the products are locked behind a glass door and you can only look through it.
that's
You got to
it.
ask a human being to come in and say, unlock it.
Yeah.
And they were very clever in designing the product and creating the security tags and everything else so
Mm.
that you can actually play with it
Yeah.
without having to walk away, without the risk of it walking away.
Mm.
So they focus experience
Yeah.
as the number one reason to make that
Mm.
work. And then Microsoft recreated it, didn't quite work. Google is now recreating Google Store. So it'll
I
be
think
very
the only
interesting
one
to see
that
how
sort
they
of
can.
recreated it to be at least close enough is probably Samsung, because
Yeah,
two doors
yeah,
two doors down from that Apple store that my son and I go to, there's a Samsung
it's
store
Samsung.
that's identical.
Yeah, yeah, right. The Galaxy
Yeah,
experience. Yeah,
exactly. And I guess maybe just to wrap up the conversation, and I think the information that you shared about the concepts of the book, they're really insightful, and thank you for your time in taking us through that conversation, in explaining your thinking around what you thought about when you wrote the book. And maybe for the benefit of the listeners, maybe we can talk a little bit briefly about the follow-up episode that we have coming up with you about the fusion strategy and how real-time data and AI will power the industrial future, which you co-authored with your best good friend Vijay Govindarajan. Maybe can you give a little bit of a sneak
yeah,
preview about the
sure.
fusion strategy?
So the 2016 book, which I've subsequently updated the 2023 version, was really about digital in the broad scale, right?
Mm-hmm.
It impacts every industry, it impacts every geography, and it impacts pretty much every society in the world, right? Digital transformation is here to stay. It's going to accelerate. But then when VG and I started discussing that book and his book on three box solution, we said there's an opportunity to focus on the asset heavy physical plus digital sectors. Because much of the example that I use here is asset light sector, plus I obviously use some asset heavy sector like agriculture and cars
Mm-hmm.
and light bulbs and so on and so forth, thermostat.
Mm-hmm.
But we said there's a message that we want to focus on, which is physical plus digital industries. And how could digital transformation impact those sectors? And by using the word fusion, we want to draw attention to the fact that it is fusion of physical plus digital, humans plus machines, which is also what I talk about here,
Mm-hmm.
traditional disciplines plus information science,
Yeah.
real world and virtual world.
Mm-hmm.
And there are multiple ways to begin to think about fusion, and which we'll explore in the next episode of the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
But we believe that as economies of the world transform, the physical plus digital part will become more important because it affects healthcare, which is physical plus digital, education, physical plus digital, retail, physical plus digital, transportation, physical plus digital, mining, physical plus digital, logistics, physical plus digital, right? Travel and hospitality, physical plus digital. And so we need to really understand where is the value shifting relative to the old industrial world towards the new industrial plus digital world. And that's what fusion strategy is all about.
Awesome. I really look forward to that conversation, Venkat. I think for being part of this 2 podcast episodes, I really thank you for your time and for the insights you shared from your book. I can't be thankful enough. I'm sure our listeners are going to get a lot out of this. And I really want to say thanks again for your time today. And I look forward to speaking to you about the Fusion Strategy book in the next episode.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye. That's it for today's episode of Transformation 2.0. I hope you found insights that will help you lead change with confidence. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. Your support helps us bring more transformational stories to leaders like you. Stay connected with us on LinkedIn, and if you have a topic or guest you would love to hear on the show, let us know. See you next time.